So I'm first going to talk about a project that we've been working on, which is assessing caribou response to different oil and gas disturbance footprints within their ranges. And the overarching driver behind these research projects links back to the federal recovery strategies for boreal and mountain caribou. So these recovery strategies recognize that there is a negative effect of disturbances on the long-term persistence of caribou herds. So within those federal documents, it outlines that at least 65% of boreal caribou range and 65% of low elevation southern mountain caribou range has to be undisturbed. And disturbed habitat is considered anything that you can see on Landsat imagery, so anything you can see from the air, and it's pipelines, roads, well sites, cut blocks, seismic lines, and so on. But it's not just the disturbance footprint itself is considered disturbance, it's also a 500-metre buffer around these different disturbances. But when we think about the dynamic nature of these disturbances, some of them are quite different on the ground. So if we think about seismic lines, legacy seismic lines in particular, some of these are quite old and are actively regenerating, so there can be a lot of vegetation growing on them. But under that federal recovery strategy, all of these would be considered exactly the same. But from an animal perspective, perhaps they're perceived quite differently. The same when it comes to well sites. There's quite different levels of activity associated with the different stages in well site development, from drilling through to reclamation and deactivation of the site. But because all of these are visible from the air, they're all considered the same under these recovery strategies. But because there's this huge amount of disturbance within caribou ranges, and we need to go in there and restore these disturbances, we really can't go in and restore everything at the same time. So understanding how caribou and their predators respond to these disturbances that are at these different stages of regeneration or different levels of activity will help us direct our restoration efforts to where they're really going to benefit caribou. So first, our seismic line project. This is a picture we took putting out some trail cameras on seismic lines last winter. And we get to ski for work sometimes, which is nice, very rarely. So our study areas for our seismic line project encompass the ranges of 5 herds, 2 boreal herds, the Little Smoky herd just north of Hinton, and the Chinchaga herd in northwest Alberta, so it's kind of near Manning. And 3 southern mountain herds, the Narraway, Red Rock, Prairie Creek, and the Alapesh. And within the ranges of these herds, there's a significant amount of seismic line footprint that really needs to be disturbed under that federal recovery strategy. And you can see that seismic line densities across these herds are quite variable, but in the Chinchaga area in particular, you can see there's areas with a very high density of seismic lines. So we had 2 primary questions we wanted to answer with this project. We want to understand how caribou and their predators responded to seismic lines that were at different stages of regeneration. So are these seismic lines all perceived equally by caribou and their predators? So seismic lines, caribou tend to avoid them, but their predators tend to like them. So they tend to be closer to seismic lines, both because they'll use them as travel corridors, but also potentially because they contain a lot of browse species that attract moose, which in turn attract predators. And we also wanted to answer a question, is there a regeneration stage when we could consider these seismic lines not disturbed anymore? So maybe these are lines we don't have to go in and restore, we focus our efforts elsewhere, because there's only a limited amount of time and funds available for these restoration projects. So to answer this question, we used LiDAR data provided by the Government of Alberta, and that was flown above our herds in 2005 to 2007. And we used GPS data from caribou, wolves, and grizzly bears to understand animal response to regeneration seismic line features. And these GPS data were provided through partnerships and collaborations with the University of Calgary, Alberta, Montana, the Government of Alberta, and with the FRI Research Grizzly Bear Program. And we looked at seasonal, the probability of each of these species being close to seismic lines at different regeneration stages across different seasons. And what we found was not really what we wanted to find, which is inevitable when it comes to wildlife research. So what we found is we couldn't find a clear threshold beyond which caribou really didn't stop, beyond which caribou ceased to respond to seismic lines. So we didn't find that nice, okay, regeneration is at 4 meters, caribou were no longer avoiding these seismic line features. It was more of a continuous relationship. And interestingly, when we looked at fine scale, the probability of caribou being close to these seismic lines, so generally they were further from them, which is in agreement with the previous research. But when caribou were close to them, which in some ranges, if you remember the Chinchaga map, in some ranges they really can't help but be close to some of these features within their ranges. When they were close to them, there was quite a large difference in seasonal responses to vegetation height on seismic lines. So these graphs, on the x-axis you have distance to seismic lines, on the y-axis it's the probability of caribou selecting these seismic lines in relation to vegetation height. So the solid black line at 1, if the dot falls above that line, the dot in the error bar falls above that line, then they were more likely to select seismic lines with higher vegetation height, and if it falls below it, it was more likely to select seismic lines with lower vegetation height. And each of these dots are color-coded by season. So if you look at the top left, which shows Alberta, you can see there's quite a large seasonal difference in whether or not they were closer to seismic lines with lower or higher vegetation heights. Remember, they were generally further from them in all seasons, but when they were close to them, this is what we found. So you can, the kind of sickly green and bright green colors representing summer and summer and fall, you can see that the lines fall above that solid line at 1, which shows that they were more likely to be closer to higher vegetation height seismic lines. But then for the other seasons, the line falls below that one, so they were more likely to be closer to lower vegetation height seismic lines. And in the little smoky shown in the bottom right, it was slightly similar. There wasn't that strong above and higher, lower difference across seasons in the little smoky. But we do see a clear pattern that when little smoky caribou are close to seismic lines, they're closer to lower vegetation height seismic lines. And this is particularly worrying because when we looked at the wolf data, we also found that wolves in all seasons like to be closer to these lower vegetation height seismic lines. So in accordance with previous research, we found that wolves were likely to be closer to seismic lines in all seasons. But then if you look at that far left of the graph, which is that closest distance to seismic lines, so within 62.5 meters of seismic lines, during all seasons, it was all of those error bars fall below that 1. So that means that in all seasons, wolves were likely to be closer to seismic lines with the lower vegetation. So this is quite worrying when we remember the caribou results. So we have in some seasons, caribou were also likely to be closer to lower vegetation height seismic lines. It's a bit of a mouthful. So there could be this functional overlap between the two species during some seasons. So perhaps these are seismic lines that we want to try and restore to decrease this, to increase the spatial separation between caribou and these predators across their ranges. But because our results didn't really let us answer this question and kind of map, okay, these seismic lines are restored and these are not, we decided to come up with a backup plan, which is also inevitable in wildlife research. So what we did is we created maps of the probability of each of these species occurring across the landscape. So I don't know if you're familiar with these maps. They include a range of different covariates related to topography, habitat type, distance and density of disturbances. And you essentially get a map across a landscape of the probability of an animal being in any particular point in that landscape. So it's usually scaled from 0 to 1, 0 probability to 1 probability. And what we did is we constructed these maps for each of our species, and then we extracted the maximum probability to the nearest seismic line segment. So we had all the seismic lines within our study areas attributed with the maximum probability that a wolf would be there at any time during the year, and the maximum probability that a caribou would be there. So here this map, red is a high probability and blue is a low. So in the Chinchaga, we only had 2 species, and we didn't have grizzly bear data, so we had wolves and caribou, and we attributed all the seismic lines, the probability of a wolf being there, probability of a caribou being there, overlaid them one another to find out if there were areas where there's a high probability of overlap between the two. And what we found was in the Chinchaga, there was really a very small footprint where there was a high probability of overlap between caribou and wolves. So these could be used as a kind of the first target for restoration within this range. But because the project we provide to our partners is a GIS product, and it essentially It has 3 columns. It has the probability of wolves, caribou, and the overlap. Partners can kind of pick which species they want to prioritise based on. The Government of Alberta can as well. So if they want to just target areas used by wolves, then maybe we forget the caribou overlap part of that equation and we just want to get the wolf population down. In West Central, we had the 3 different species to overlap. So we mapped the probability of caribou wolf overlap and caribou grizzly bear overlap. We didn't really care about wolf grizzly bear overlap. And we did this across the 4 herds, and again, red is a high probability of overlap and blue is a low probability of overlap. So we got quite different values across the different herds, depending on the habitat preferences of these 3 species. So in Little Smoky was almost 1,000 kilometres, that had a very high probability of overlap between the different species, while in the Narrow it was only 33 kilometres. So again, this is a GIS product that we have provided to our partners, and they can choose what they want to define their habitat restoration, what targets they want to use within their habitat restoration approaches. Okay, but that's not the end of our seismic line research. We are currently carrying out research looking at alternate prey of these seismic lines. So that's a key driver in whether in wolf response to these linear features. So wolves will use these low vegetation height seismic lines as travel corridors, but they're also potentially attracted to them because moose are attracted to them. So we wanted to understand moose, deer, and all these other animal responses to seismic lines. And we're doing this using trail cameras. It's an ongoing project. I have no results to show you. But we distributed them on seismic lines at different vegetation heights, and we're trying to understand moose, deer, elk, and other species' response to these different linear features. And we are also linking this to vegetation data. So we had field crews out across these 5 ranges over the last 3 years. They collected field data from 1,200 plots in total, and we're using these to create models of the probability and presence of different foods preferred by ungulates, and vegetation height as well, and we're going to link that to the ungulate data that we get from the trail cameras to try and see if food on seismic lines predicts whether or not animals are going to use them as well. So the end goal of this part of the project will be a GIS layer similar to what we produced for stage 1, but attributed with ungulate use, and then we'll overlay that on our previous restoration priorities based on caribou predator overlap and try and get those numbers down to a more manageable number that our partners can use to go out there in the field and target restoration that will be the most beneficial for caribou. So that's the first project. The second one was looking at well sites. I'm very quickly going to go through this because I'm probably going to go over time. So we were interested in caribou response to well sites at different stages of activity. So again, understanding whether or not some of these could be considered not disturbed anymore under that federal recovery strategy, or whether at those higher disturbance stages, perhaps we need to consider the spatial and temporal distribution of caribou within their ranges when we're doing these higher activity phases. If caribou have a very strong response to well sites when there's a lot of activity at them, then maybe we want to consider that, particularly during vulnerable times of the year like calving, to try and kind of minimize and do the best that we can for caribou on a shared landscape. So we wanted to look at calving site selection and well site activities. So our caribou choosing calving sites that are far or close to well sites, and how does this differ across different well site activities? So again, trying to produce a tool for our partners that they can plan future development to consider caribou. And then we also wanted to understand caribou response to these different activities. And our study area for this project was the 2 boreal herds, the Chinchaga and the Little Smoky. Again, we used GPS data provided by government partners and Weyerhaeuser, and we used well site data provided by the Alberta Energy Regulator. And when it came to calving, we didn't really find anything very exciting, disappointingly. So there was no differential response to different well site activity phases. Caribou just generally selected areas far from well sites during calving. But we do want to expand on this project. We do want to map the probability of any area within a caribou range being picked as a calving site location, and then provide this to partners so that they can make informed decisions about future developments, particularly during just that 1 month segment when caribou are calving. So we don't want the moms with their newborn calves to have to move away because that could affect long-term calf survival. And we just found some general results. In Chinchaga, specific habitats were selected. In the Little Smoky, that generally they just liked lower densities of anthropogenic disturbance. In Chinchaga, it was far from cut blocks, were areas where they calved, but also areas in higher density of seismic lines. This is an artifact of the areas that are far from cut blocks are areas that have a higher density of seismic lines. So they're kind of caught between which disturbance to avoid on the landscape. When it came to seasonal response, generally found a much stronger response to the higher activity stages of well sites than to the lower activity. So here, if the error bar and the dot falls above that dotted horizontal line at 0, then they were further from those well sites, and if it falls below 0, then they were kind of closer to those well sites. So you can see that during most seasons, they were further from well sites at that medium or high activity phases in the Chinchaga. And in Little Smoky, we actually found a threshold of response to well sites. So in late winter and early winter, we actually found, so the solid black line is the high activity well sites, and we found that the animals were avoiding those by up to 3 kilometers. For the other activity phases, it was kind of a consistent negative relationship. They were just generally further from them, but there wasn't a clear threshold beyond which the probability increased. But here you can see, so it's kilometers on the x-axis, and the y-axis is the probability of a caribou being there. You can see it does go up quite steeply after 3 kilometers. So they do seem to have quite a strong avoidance response to these short bursts of higher activity on the landscape. So maybe we could consider that in future management. So conclusion-wise, we did find regeneration does affect animal response, but it was quite variable, frustratingly variable across seasons and species, but we were still able to integrate our analysis, the responses of different species to prioritize areas for restoration. Well site response was also quite variable across different seasons, but generally they avoided high activity phases. So when it comes to management, what can we do on the ground with this information? Well, seismic line restoration, the GIS product we provided can be used to implement habitat restoration to target reducing predator use of seismic lines or reducing the overlap between caribou and predators. Or we can consider a lot of other biodiversity and economic values in the landscape. So caribou aren't the only threatened species within their range, so maybe we want to integrate other animals when we're considering where to focus restoration efforts. When it comes to well sites, because we did get quite a seasonal difference, and we did get that much stronger response to the higher activity phases, then perhaps we could consider the spatio-temporal distribution of caribou in their ranges when it comes to future development. Perhaps implement mitigation measures when caribou are nearby, if we know they're nearby, and of course try and restore these more inactive well sites. They didn't have as clear a response to those, so if we can get them back to good forest quicker, then that will probably be beneficial to caribou as well. And I'd just like to thank the following people. This project is a large collaboration between a number of universities, the Grizzly Bear program, and my team at the Caribou program, and then all the technicians that trudge through the swamps of the Chinchaga to collect our field data that I have yet to analyse, but I'm going to do it next week. And of course, all our partners who provided funds and in-kind support to this research project.